Nobody expected it. Not the production crew, not the commentators, not even the people sitting courtside with their phones half raised. It was supposed to be a standard post-game wrap-up. Another microphone, another player, another round of carefully worded answers designed to say everything while revealing nothing. The WNBA had perfected that routine. Smile, deflect, move on. But Sophie Cunningham didn't get that memo. In less than 15 seconds, she walked up to that microphone and detonated something the league had been sitting on for over a year. No filter, no PR coaching, no pause to consider the consequences, just raw, uncut truth delivered with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from someone who genuinely does not care what happens next. And what she said didn't just go viral, it cracked something open. Something the league had been desperately trying to keep sealed. If you think Caitlin Clark isn't the face of this league, you are just flat out wrong. And she didn't stop there. She went further. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear, in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a debate she was interested in having. This was a verdict. And the WNBA, it had no idea what to do with that. What you need to understand before anything else is that this moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst from someone having a bad day. Sophie Cunningham had been watching for months, quietly, carefully, cataloging every elbow, every side eye, every whisper that floated through the league like smoke. She wasn't paranoid, she was paying attention. Because the treatment Caitlin Clark had been receiving since the moment she stepped into the WNBA wasn't subtle anymore. It had just been ignored. Late hits that came after the whistle, shoves that referees conveniently didn't catch, smirks on opposing benches when she went down. And through it all, the league said almost nothing. No strong statements, no accountability, just the occasional vague reference to player conduct that addressed everything while protecting no one. Sophie saw the pattern, and more importantly, she remembered it. There's a specific kind of anger that builds slowly, one incident at a time, until it reaches a point where it has nowhere left to go except out. That's what Sophie was carrying. Every ignored foul, every uncalled play, every moment the league looked away while its most watched player absorbed another hit, Sophie filed it away. And when the match finally met the fuse, the explosion wasn't just inevitable, it was calculated. She didn't lose her temper, she made a decision. The night it all spilled over started like most WNBA games do. Indiana Fever versus Connecticut Sun, a rivalry that had been simmering all season, charged with the kind of energy that makes referees nervous and commentators speak faster than usual. And for a while, it stayed inside the lines. Then J.C. Sheldon went after Caitlin Clark again. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't even close to the first time. But something about that particular moment, the sixth hit in a single game, with officials watching and doing essentially nothing, something in Sophie Cunningham finally said enough. She didn't wait for a whistle. She became one. Sophie stepped in, grabbed Sheldon, and made it absolutely clear that whatever was happening was going to stop. Not a gentle nudge, not a verbal warning, not the kind of half-hearted teammate intervention that gets forgotten by the next quarter. A full, physical, unmistakable message that said, "This ends." The crowd froze. The commentators stumbled over their words. The referees scrambled to respond. They hit her with $900. Reportedly, Sophie laughed. Not because she thought it was funny in an amused way, but because $900 was the league's answer to months of unaddressed physical targeting of the WNBA's biggest star. $900. She is said to have looked at that number and essentially shrugged, treating it like the price of doing what everyone else in that building had been too cautious to do. And honestly, given what her actions cost the league in credibility over the next 48 hours, that fine might be the worst trade the WNBA ever made. What happened after the final buzzer, away from the cameras and the commentators, is the part that cuts deeper than any highlight reel could. In the locker room, Caitlin Clark turned to Sophie and said one word: "Finally." Not thank you, not wow, not I can't believe you did that, just finally. One word carrying the full weight of every foul that went uncalled, every hit she absorbed without retaliation, every moment she kept her composure while the people around her stayed silent. Finally. Sophie looked back at her and said 3 words in return.
I got you. No cameras, no press, no one performing for an audience. Just 2 players in a locker room and a moment so honest it almost doesn't belong in professional sports. But nothing stays private in 2025. By the time the sweat had dried on the court, the footage was already everywhere. Twitter got the slow-motion replays first, frame-by-frame breakdowns of Sophie's intervention, each one captioned with some variation of the same message: protect the queen. TikTok went a different direction, overlaying the clip with gladiator music and action movie edits that turned a basketball play into something cinematic. Instagram filled up with tributes, memes, and long captions from fans who had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of moment without quite knowing it. They started calling her the enforcer, the bodyguard, the last person in professional basketball willing to say what everyone else was only whispering. And then, the numbers started moving. Sophie Cunningham had around 200,000 followers before that night. Within 48 hours, she crossed 1 million. Her jerseys sold out. Fans who had never attended a WNBA game in their lives were posting about buying tickets. Middle school kids were reportedly imitating her during practice, acting out her intervention like it was a scene from a movie they wanted to be part of. Parents were writing long, emotional posts about what it meant to watch a woman stand up without hesitation when the people in charge had chosen to look away. One person posted on social media that they had never watched a single WNBA game before, but would now go just to support Sophie. That sentence tells you everything about what this moment had become. It stopped being about basketball before most people even knew it had started. And at the Indiana Fever's next home game, when Sophie stepped onto the court, the crowd didn't just cheer, they chanted her name over and over, loud enough that the building vibrated with it. Sophie, Sophie, Sophie. It was the kind of reception usually reserved for players who have just won championships, not someone who threw an intentional foul and got fined less than $1,000 for it. But that's the thing, it was never really about the foul. What Sophie Cunningham did on that court was the visible part, the part people filmed and shared and turned into slow-motion content. But underneath it was something older and uglier that had been operating in the WNBA long before Caitlin Clark ever arrived. A quiet campaign, not organized in any formal sense, but recognizable to anyone who understood the league's internal culture. Veterans who had spent years building something under the radar in arenas that weren't full, in time slots that television networks treated as an afterthought. Some of them did not react well when Clark arrived and changed everything almost overnight. The whispers weren't hard to find if you were listening. She doesn't belong here yet. She hasn't paid her dues. She's just another overhyped prospect who got famous too fast. And underneath all of that, something uglier that most people didn't say out loud, but didn't work very hard to hide either. She's taking up space that isn't hers. What's important to understand is that these were rumors and sentiments circulating within fan communities and media circles, not confirmed statements from specific players, but the on-court behavior told its own story. Hit after hit, foul after uncalled foul, a pattern that built itself one game at a time and that the league's officiation consistently failed to address. Sophie had been watching all of it. She kept mental receipts while others pretended not to notice, and when she finally decided she'd seen enough, she didn't just defend her teammate, she exposed the entire structure that had allowed this to go on. Because here's what nobody wanted to say at the press conference level. The dehumanization of Caitlin Clark was not an accident. It was not a coincidence that referees repeatedly missed fouls on the league's most watched player. It was not random that veterans with influence treated her arrival like a threat rather than a gift. Patterns don't repeat themselves 6 times in one game by accident. Sophie knew that. She said it out loud, and that's why the league panicked. The WNBA's response to all of this was, in its own way, just as revealing as Sophie's outburst. There was almost no response at all. The Fever's front office went quiet. Social media went dark. The PR team, which had been perfectly capable of releasing statements about player conduct and league values when it suited them, suddenly had nothing to say. No defense of Clark, no acknowledgement of the pattern Sophie described, no statement that resembled anything human or specific or real. Just corporate silence. And that silence was loud enough to hear from the upper deck.
Because here's what the silence communicated, whether the league intended it to or not. They knew. They knew about the targeting. They knew about the officiating failures. They knew that their biggest star had been absorbing punishment that should have been addressed months ago. And they had made a calculation that the business of profiting from Caitlin Clark's attention was more valuable than the business of actually protecting her. The WNBA had been riding the wave Clark created. Viewership numbers up, merchandise sales spiking, new fans flooding into arenas that had been half empty for years. Television networks suddenly treating women's basketball like a property worth investing in. All of that came from Clark, her presence, her skill, her marketability, the cultural moment her arrival created. And yet, when it came to protecting her on the court, actually intervening, actually holding people accountable, actually saying this player will be defended, the league folded. The suits collected the revenue and left the trenches to someone else. That someone else turned out to be Sophie Cunningham. And when Sophie went scorched earth in that post-game interview, pointing the flamethrower directly at the league's executives, calling out the double standard, making it impossible to pretend the officiating failures were isolated incidents, the league's silence looked less like a PR strategy and more like guilt. It was not just bad officiating she was exposing. She was describing a system, a structure that needed Caitlin Clark's spotlight but wasn't willing to take responsibility for the cost of having it. Sophie wasn't finished after the court incident, not even close, because what followed in the days after was a different kind of offense, slower, more deliberate, and in some ways more damaging than anything that had happened during the game. She went after the league's leadership with the kind of specificity that press conferences usually exist to prevent. She talked about referees who dressed in expensive clothes and handed out no real consequences while Clark bled for their league. She talked about executives who had built their recent success on Clark's back and then refused to say her name when she needed defending. Those words did not stay in the interview. They jumped off the screen and onto protest signs. They showed up on t-shirts outside arenas. They became captions on videos that racked up millions of views in a matter of hours. Sophie's post-game comments didn't feel like a media appearance. They felt like a manifesto, like someone who had been composing a document in their head for months and finally had a microphone long enough to read the whole thing out loud. The internet didn't just watch, it organized. Clark's fan base, and by this point it extended far beyond traditional WNBA viewership, had been watching the hits pile up without consequences for an entire season. They had been reading the box scores and seeing the foul counts and doing the math that the league's officiating seemed incapable of doing. They were ready. Sophie's words gave them a direction. Banners appeared outside stadiums, comment sections flooded with demands for accountability. Fans who had never been particularly vocal about sports politics suddenly had a cause that felt personal, because it was. Sophie had framed it in a way that made the stakes clear. If the league won't protect the player who is filling these arenas, what exactly is the league for? That question did not have a comfortable answer. Then came the quote that reframed everything. In the middle of all the chaos, somewhere between the viral clips and the jersey sellouts and the chanting crowds, Sophie said something that cut through all of it, something that wasn't about Clark specifically, or the Sun, or the referees, or even the fine. Something that looked directly at the WNBA's identity crisis and named it without flinching. This is what we always wanted. Why are we angry that it's finally happening? Sit with that for a second. Because what she was describing beneath the surface of player rivalries and officiating controversies was something the league had been struggling with since the moment Clark arrived and changed its trajectory. For years, WNBA veterans had fought for visibility. They had played in underfunded arenas, traveled on commercial flights while their NBA counterparts took charters, accepted salaries that required off-season jobs overseas just to make ends meet. They built the league on sacrifice and grit and a level of dedication that most sports fans never fully appreciated. And then Clark arrived, and the cameras followed, and the arenas filled up, and the league's business fundamentals changed almost overnight in ways that all those years of sacrifice had failed to produce.
Some players embraced it, others didn't. And the ones who didn't, the ones whose resentment quietly shaped how Clark was treated on the court, weren't just reacting to one player. They were reacting to what her arrival implied about all those years before her, that it took this to make people care, that the league they had built wasn't enough on its own. Sophie's quote didn't excuse the resentment, but it named the wound underneath it, and it called on everyone, players, executives, fans, to decide whether the league was going to build on what Clark had brought or burn it down trying to resist it. That was not a line any league executive had the courage to say. It took someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from honesty. And then, as if the on-court incident and the viral interview and the fan uprising weren't enough, came the news that added a completely different dimension to everything. The Fever's president stepped down. The timing was, to put it generously, notable. In the middle of the biggest controversy the franchise had seen in years, with one of its players at the center of a league-wide cultural reckoning, the person at the top of the organizational chart quietly exited. No dramatic statement, no press conference, no explanation that addressed what had been happening on the court or in the media in any direct way. Just gone. The league said nothing meaningful about that either, which by this point had become its signature move. The WNBA's communication strategy in the aftermath of everything Sophie had triggered consisted almost entirely of saying as little as possible and hoping the news cycle would eventually move on. It didn't move on. The fans made sure of that, because what the league may have miscalculated, what its silence and corporate deflection consistently failed to account for, was the nature of the audience Clark had brought in. These were not passive viewers. They were not the kind of fans who would read a bland official statement, nod politely, and go back to their lives. They were engaged, opinionated, and organized in the way that internet communities can be when they feel strongly about something. They had watched the hits, tracked the non-calls, and built a detailed case in comment sections and group chats and Reddit threads. Sophie Cunningham didn't start that fire. She just handed it a match. And when the smoke cleared enough for the league to actually assess the damage, what it found was a fan base that had grown dramatically, a player who had become a symbol of something larger than basketball, and a fundamental question that could no longer be deferred or deflected or dressed up in corporate language. Was the WNBA willing to protect the people making it relevant? Here's where things stand, and why none of this is actually finished. Sophie Cunningham walked into a post-game interview as a role player on a team with a famous teammate. She walked out as something the WNBA genuinely did not have before, a truth teller with receipts, a platform, and absolutely no interest in playing the game the way the league preferred. She wasn't trying to be a hero. That's what makes it hit differently than a calculated media play would. She was just a player who had watched something happen for too long and decided in a specific moment that she was done pretending it wasn't happening. The fame that followed wasn't the goal, the accountability was. And what her moment revealed, what the viral clip and the Manifesto interview and the fan uprising and the president's departure all point back to, is a league at a genuine crossroads. The WNBA has spent the last year benefiting from something it didn't fully understand and couldn't fully control. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring fans, she brought expectations. Expectations about how stars get treated, how accountability works, how a league that claims to care about its players actually demonstrates that care when it's inconvenient. Sophie Cunningham held up a mirror. The reflection wasn't flattering. The league now faces a choice that's more binary than its PR team would like to admit. It can adapt, genuinely, structurally, in ways that are visible and measurable and don't disappear when the news cycle moves on. Or it can keep doing what it's been doing, collecting the revenue, issuing the vague statements, and hoping that the people it's depending on don't notice the gap between what it says and what it does. But the fans noticed, the players are noticing, and Sophie Cunningham made sure that noticing was no longer a quiet, private thing. Caitlin Clark brought the crowd, Sophie Cunningham brought the conflict, and the WNBA, whether it's ready or not, is going to have to answer for both. This story is nowhere near over, and next time you see a headline about the Fever, about Clark, about the league's officiating or its front office decisions, remember this moment. Remember what happened when one player decided that silence was no longer something she was willing to perform. Because that one decision changed everything. And some things, once changed, don't change back.